Welcome back to Private Pilot Virtual Test Prep, Lesson Number 2, Aircraft Systems. I'm Matt Dragon. Now, you need to know the different airplane systems to understand how they impact aircraft performance. Now, airplane engine, the fuel system, and carburetor or fuel injection system will be covered in this lesson. As you learn more about the typical general aviation aircraft systems, you'll understand how these systems function together to keep the airplane flying safely and efficiently. You'll learn about the importance of using checklists when you check these systems prior to each flight. A thorough pre-flight inspection is essential to ensuring the aircraft you're going to fly is safe and airworthy. Now, while this lesson will prepare you for the FAA knowledge test and give you the information you need to operate safely as a pilot, it won't make you an aircraft mechanic. Your local A&P can add additional insight. If you understand engines, be they automotive or airplane, much of what we'll cover will be familiar to you. However, I suggest you follow along carefully so you'll know exactly what the FAA wants you to know as pilot in command. Now, this lesson covers the following concepts: the four-stroke engine, engine temperatures, fuel induction systems, carburetor icing, fuel grades, ignition systems, the propeller, pre-flight inspections, and hand propping. Okay, let's join our instructor in the class for four-stroke engines.
Here is a typical general aviation four-stroke internal combustion engine. Now, engines convert fuel energy into power through four strokes of a piston. On the first stroke, the intake valve opens and a fuel-air mixture is drawn into the cylinder. On the second stroke, the piston travels up to compress the fuel-air mixture. This is called the compression stroke. The third stroke of the piston is called the power stroke, and it's where the spark plug ignites the fuel-air mixture and pushes the piston down. This turns into a rotational force which is connected to the crankshaft because the piston is connected through a linkage mechanism called the connecting rod. The crankshaft transmits power to the propeller, which in turn creates thrust. Finally, on the exhaust stroke, the expended fuel-air mixture is pushed out of the cylinder through the exhaust valve. It takes 2 evolutions of the crankshaft to repeat this process, or about 1,200 times a minute on a light aircraft engine.
Say, you're in luck. The four-stroke engine is so straightforward, we don't have an FAA test question for you. So let's move on to a new topic. The topic is engine temperature. We'll see you back here in a few.
Let's explore how airplane engines are cooled. Cooling air enters the cowling at the front of the cowl and travels over the cylinders and out the bottom of the cowling, as you see right here. The white arrows that you see in this next graphic indicate the path that the air takes as it enters the cowling. Notice that as the air passes over the cylinders, it exits the bottom of the cowling as shown by these orange arrows because the air has now been warmed by the engine. Some engines use cowl flaps to regulate the engine cooling air flow. Internally air-cooled reciprocating engines are especially dependent on the circulation of lubricating oil throughout the engine for cooling. The oil reduces friction and removes heat from the engine and dissipates it in the oil cooler. An aircraft is required to have an oil temperature gauge, such as the one that you see right here, and it must be located in plain sight of the pilot in the cockpit so the pilot can determine if the temperature is dangerously high. Now, high engine temperatures can be caused by any of the following conditions: operating with too much engine power, an excessive climb rate at too low an airspeed, using fuel with an octane rating that is too low for the engine, operating with a fuel mixture that is too lean, and finally, operating the engine with a low level of oil. Correcting any of these situations may lower the engine temperature. Now, excessively high engine temperatures may cause the following situations. First of all, a loss of power, excessive oil consumption, and possible permanent internal engine damage. If the engine overheats during climb out, reduce your rate of climb and increase the airspeed. In other words, lower the nose to increase airflow to cool the engine. Now, if it's still overheating, try to enrich the fuel-air mixture. Because of the many moving parts in a reciprocating engine, as soon as the engine is started, power should be set to the recommended warm-up RPM. Then, the engine gauges should be checked for the desired indications. It is important to check the oil pressure for operation within the manufacturer's time limit. If you don't see the instruments in the green, shut down the engine.
Welcome back. Let's take time now for a question on engine temperature. For internal cooling, reciprocating aircraft engines are especially dependent on. Once again, you have three possible answers. Take some time to look at them. Okay, let's answer that question. Question, for internal cooling, reciprocating aircraft engines are especially dependent on C, the circulation of lubrication oil. Now, remember, oil used primarily to lubricate the moving parts of the engine also cools the internal parts of the engine as it circulates. Let's get back with our instructor right now for a new topic, fuel induction systems.
In most general aviation airplanes, a carburetor or fuel injector delivers a fuel mixture to the cylinders. Now, a carburetor is designed to deliver the correct mixture at sea level, but not as the airplane climbs to higher altitudes. Therefore, the pilot must control the fuel-air mixture to maintain the best engine performance. The throttle controls the amount of the fuel-air mixture sent to the engine. It is necessary for the pilot to control the ratio of air to fuel in this mixture when climbing or descending. This is done by adjusting the red mixture knob that you see right here. This adjusts the fuel ratio by applying more or less fuel in relation to the given density of air. When flying at high altitudes, the air is less dense. This may cause the fuel-air mixture to become too rich if it is not properly adjusted. A rich mixture is one in which the fuel-air ratio has too much fuel for the given volume of air that is entering the cylinders. Therefore, the pilot should lean the mixture. In other words, decrease the amount of fuel flowing to the engine. This action compensates for the decreased air density.
We're in the studio now with a long-admired member of the aviation community, Mr. Bob Gardner. Now, Bob actually began his career in Alaska, actually as a hobby while he was with the Coast Guard. Since then, he's been an instructor, a designated pilot examiner, a charter pilot, and a corporate pilot, and we welcome him. Now, Bob, you've flown in a lot of varied climates. How does location factor into the fuel-air mixture?
Well, what you really asked me about, Matt, is density altitude. The key concepts are high, hot, and humid. Whether you fly to a higher altitude or drive to a higher altitude, you're getting up there where the air molecules are further apart, the air is less dense. The ideal mixture is 1 part fuel to 16 parts of air. And if you leave the mixture alone and get into less dense air, the mixture is going to become too rich. You have to lean out to restore that balance. The last thing is humidity. If you fly into a more humid climate, the air gets less dense and you have to restore that balance.
However, when you descend from altitude, you need to enrich the mixture to compensate for the increase in air density. If you descend without adjusting the mixture, the fuel-air mixture may become excessively lean. This means you have insufficient fuel for the increased air density at the lower altitudes. Now, when performing a run-up at a high elevation airport, the air is less dense. If you notice a slight engine roughness during the carburetor heat check, try a leaner setting of the mixture.
Bob, we've heard that it's tempting for pilots to play it safe by keeping the fuel mixture full rich, but that's not really playing it safe, is it?
No, not at all. Many students, especially those that learn to fly at flatland altitudes, never get any higher than 5,000 feet during their training. And when they finally do get up to 9,000 or 10,000 feet and the engine starts to lose power and it starts to slow down, they wonder what it could possibly be, possibly carb ice. So they pull the carb heat control out and the engine almost quits because they've put less dense air into a mixture that was too rich in the first place. So you've got to continue to lean out as you climb to keep that 16-to-1 balance at all times.
Okay, let's take some time now to address a question on fuel induction systems. Here's our question. The basic purpose of adjusting the fuel-air mixture at altitude is to, again, 3 possible correct answers, but only one is right. Study them. I've got my answer. Do you have yours? Okay, question again. The basic purpose of adjusting the fuel-air mixture at altitude is to B, decrease the fuel flow in order to compensate for decreased air density. Remember, the mixture becomes richer as the airplane gains altitude because the carburetor meters the same amount of fuel as at sea level. Leaning the mixture prevents this by decreasing the rate of fuel discharge to compensate for the decrease in air density. Your answer, pretty straightforward. Now let's move on to another topic. This topic, carburetor icing. We'll see you back here in just a bit.
Here are some views of a typical engine you'll see in a general aviation aircraft. At the engine bottom is the carburetor. Looking inside the carburetor, notice the unusual carburetor components: the air intake, the fuel supply entering the carburetor, and the throttle valve. From this point, the air-fuel mixture travels to the engine. If your aircraft has fuel injection, there will be no carburetor in the engine, and the fuel will be directly injected into each engine cylinder. On fuel-injected engines, fuel is injected directly into the cylinders rather than being vaporized in a carburetor. Since the cylinder is hot, there is not much danger of icing when the fuel combines with intake air and vaporizes. Both fuel injection and carburetor systems have their own considerations for icing conditions. Let's cover the carbureted engine first. A float-type carburetor is commonly found in many general aviation aircraft, and you see one right here. It operates by a differential air pressure present at the carburetor throat. This throat is also called the venturi. However, carburetors are not without problems. As the air flows through the venturi, the fuel vaporization can cause the temperature to drop by as much as 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This may cause a condition known as carburetor icing. You can see the buildup of ice right here in the throat of the carburetor. A carburetor ice is most likely to form when the outside temperature is between 20 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit with high humidity or visible moisture. The first sign of carburetor icing in a fixed-pitch propeller airplane is a loss of engine RPM. If you suspect carburetor icing, apply carburetor heat immediately. Carburetor heat is an anti-icing system that preheats the air entering the carburetor. When applying carburetor heat, two things happen. First, carburetor heat enriches the fuel-air mixture because the warm air entering the engine is less dense, but the amount of fuel is unchanged. This causes an excess of the required fuel-air ratio because of the decreased air density. Secondly, the richer mixture causes a decrease in RPM or manifold pressure. Generally, using carburetor heat decreases engine performance. Now, if there's ice in the carburetor and heat is applied, it will melt and be ingested into the engine. This causes the engine to run even rougher and reduce engine RPM even more. But don't worry, things are going to get better in just a matter of seconds. As that ice melts, RPM and manifold pressure will gradually increase. Fuel-injected and carbureted engines are susceptible to another type of icing called induction icing. Now, induction icing is a condition where induction air, usually taken in near the air filter, is blocked by ice. The remedy is to use alternate induction air. Ice usually forms in the induction area when flying in visible moisture or in freezing temperatures.
Okay, welcome back. Let's take this question on carburetor icing. The presence of carburetor ice in an aircraft equipped with a fixed-pitch propeller can be verified by applying carburetor heat and noting A, B, or C. Please take time to have a look. Okay, you have your answer? I'll pose the question again. The presence of carburetor ice in an aircraft equipped with a fixed-pitch propeller can be verified by applying carburetor heat and noting C, a decrease in RPM and then a gradual increase in RPM. Once again, if ice is present, there will be a decrease in RPM and then a gradual increase in RPM. That's your answer. And now for a new topic. Moving on to fuel grades. We'll see you back here in just a bit.
Fuel acts as an agent for combustion and as an agent for cooling based on the mixture setting. Engine fuels are available in different grades or octane ratings coded by distinct colors. Aviation fuels are color-coded to make it easy to tell the fuel rating and type. Now, if you sump your fuel tanks and find red fuel when you normally see blue, you know you've got a problem. Let's take a look at each fuel grade individually. The red fuel is 80 octane. 80 octane fuel is found in lower performance general aviation aircraft that have lower compression engines. Next, the blue fuel is called 100 low lead. 100 low lead is typically found in higher performance aircraft that use high compression engines. Jet fuel is colorless, and as you can guess, jet fuel is used in jet and turbine powered engines. If the recommended fuel is not available for your aircraft, then you must use the next higher grade of fuel.
Does fuel grade or even fuel contamination play a role in fuel mixture?
Well, certainly fuel grade affects engine operation, but the engine still wants that 16-to-1 ratio of air to fuel. The question should never come up if pilots use the fuel that's recommended by the engine manufacturer. Other contaminants can clog carbureted jets or fuel injectors and starve the cylinders for fuel, but the mixture control is still necessary to restore that 16-to-1 balance.
Detonation may occur in reciprocating engines when there is an explosive burn of the fuel-air mixture rather than a normal, even progressive burn within the cylinder. Detonation may be caused by too low a fuel grade or too lean an air-fuel mixture. Now, this explosion causes an excessive force pushing down on the cylinder. This can cause excessive engine wear. Detonation dramatically raises engine operating temperatures and also increases wear and tear on the engine. If you experience engine detonation during takeoff, lower the nose slightly. This tactic increases airflow, improves engine cooling, and reduces engine's workload. Remember, detonation may cause internal engine component failure. Another engine combustion problem is pre-ignition. Pre-ignition is the uncontrolled firing of the mixture prior to normal spark ignition. Pre-ignition is caused by incandescent or glowing areas within the cylinder. These incandescent areas serve as an igniter prior to normal ignition. This incandescent area can be caused by a carbon or lead deposit heated to a red-hot glow. Now, here are some tips you should know about proper fuel management. First, filling the fuel tank after the last flight of the day is always a good practice. This prevents moisture condensation in the fuel tank by eliminating the airspace created in the tanks when they're partially full. Fuel can be contaminated by water and dirt. Humid air inside fuel tanks can cool at night, resulting in significant water being added to the fuel through condensation. Since water and most contaminants settle to the fuel tank bottom, thoroughly drain all sumps, drains, and strainers before a flight to purge contaminants and water. If your aircraft is equipped with fuel pumps, either engine-driven or electrically powered, remember, don't run the tanks dry before switching tanks. This may cause the fuel or boost pump to draw air into the fuel system, causing vapor lock and or damaging the fuel pump, thus ultimately resulting in an engine stoppage. Dirt contamination can also be introduced into the fuel. This occurs when refueling equipment is poorly maintained or if the refueling operation is done carelessly. Use care when refueling the aircraft.
All right, moving right along, let's pose this question about fuel grades. If the grade of fuel used in an aircraft engine is lower than specified for the engine, it will most likely cause which of these three potential answers? Have a look. Okay, I've got my answer. We hope you have yours at this time. The question again, if the grade of fuel used in an aircraft engine is lower than specified for the engine, it will most likely cause C, detonation. A reminder here, using aviation fuel of a lower rating is harmful under any circumstances because it may cause loss of power, excessive heat, burned spark plugs, burned and sticky valves, high oil consumption, and potentially detonation. So there you have it on that topic, fuel grades. Let's move on to another topic. This one, ignition systems. Join your instructor now in the classroom.
Airplane engines must be very reliable. Now, one way of achieving that reliability is through the ignition system. The ignition is generated by engine-driven magnetos mounted on the accessory case located on the back of the engine. The magneto is a completely independent power system and separate from the electrical system. If the airplane loses all electrical power, the engine will continue to run. Aircraft engines have two completely independent magnetos. These magnetos also have an independent set of spark plugs. Each magneto drives one complete set of spark plugs. Each cylinder has two sets of spark plugs. The second spark plug is driven by the other magneto. This is what's called a dual ignition system. This system increases safety and also improves engine performance by providing more efficient fuel-air mixture combustion. This picture illustrates the rear view of an engine. The two magnetos have individual ignition leads. Each lead is routed to an individual cylinder and connected to the spark plug in those cylinders.
Welcome back to the studio. Let's tackle this question on ignition systems. The question: one purpose of the dual ignition system on an aircraft engine is to provide for, again, three potential answers, only one is correct. Have a look. All right, time enough? Good. The question again: one purpose of the dual ignition system on an aircraft engine is to provide for A, improved engine performance. A reminder, the dual ignition system has two magnetos to supply electrical current to two spark plugs for each combustion chamber. This provides both redundancy of ignition and an improvement of engine performance. Okay, let's get back to your instructor and a brand new topic. This topic, propellers. We'll see you back here in just a bit.
We'll go into a little more detail on the operation of propellers. The crankshaft's rotational force or torque is delivered to the propeller. The propeller then converts power into thrust. Most small airplanes have what's called a fixed pitch propeller. A fixed pitch propeller has no mechanical mechanism to change the angle of the propeller blades while in flight. In airplanes with a fixed pitch propeller, power is controlled exclusively with the throttle. The amount of power is indicated by engine RPM shown on the tachometer. Now, in high-performance airplanes, the pilot may actually select the blade angle for the performance desired at that particular time. This type of propeller is called a constant speed propeller. The main advantage of a constant speed prop is the ability to select a blade angle for the most efficient performance for specific phases of flight. These include climbing or cruising flight. If it is a constant speed or RPM, then the blade angle automatically changes to maintain that RPM that is set by the pilot. As the engine produces torque, the propeller blade angle increases. This causes the blades to take a bigger bite out of the air. This has the net effect of keeping the engine's RPM constant. With this type of propeller, the throttle controls power output as indicated on the manifold pressure gauge. The propeller control regulates the engine RPM. The desired power is achieved by selecting certain combinations of propeller RPM and manifold pressure. Now, care should be taken when setting these two controls simultaneously. You may overstress the engine with high manifold pressure in combination with a low engine RPM. The manifold pressure gauge is simply a barometer that measures the air pressure in the intake manifold in inches of mercury.
We're back in the studio with a question and a timeout, but a good question on propellers. This a little bit more difficult here, so please read carefully. Question: how is engine operation controlled on an engine equipped with a constant speed propeller? Again, please read very carefully these three potential answers. Wow. Hope you selected the correct answer. I hope I did too. Here's the question: how is engine operation controlled on an engine equipped with a constant speed propeller? The answer is A. The throttle controls power output as registered on the manifold pressure gauge, and the propeller control regulates engine RPM. Once again, a reminder, the throttle controls power output as registered on the manifold pressure gauge, and the propeller control regulates engine RPM. Now let's move on to a brand new topic. This, pre-flight inspections. You'll have fun with this and we'll see you back here.
There are many moving parts in an airplane, and it is imperative that all systems are functional before flight. Unlike a car, where an engine problem is merely an inconvenience, in an airplane, a sudden engine stoppage or other malfunction can have serious consequences. Therefore, a thorough pre-flight inspection should be completed prior to every flight to ensure the aircraft is prepared for a safe flight. The use of checklists is important to ensure that all necessary flight instruments, systems, and components are checked thoroughly. Each aircraft should have an approved written checklist. This checklist is sometimes part of the Pilot Operating Handbook, or POH, or is provided on a separate laminated checklist. If the airplane has been stored a long time since its last flight, in addition to the usual checklist items, the airplane should also be checked for additional items. The items may be damage or obstruction caused by animals, birds or insects, including deterioration and corrosion caused by the elements, or even vandalism.
Bob, we all know the importance of a checklist, having a checklist, but can you give us some tips on a proper pre-flight inspection?
I would recommend that people use their ears as well as their eyes as they move the ailerons and elevator during the pre-flight inspection. Listen. Anything that's operated by a cable or a push rod can develop little hitches. Listen for those things. Feel for those things. Another thing you can do, although it's not pre-flight, is when you shut down the engine, listen to those gyros spinning down. Are they spinning down slowly and smoothly, or do they flop over on one side? These are all things you can do with your ears as well as with your eyes.
5 Aurora, downwind runway 35 Aurora.
Aurora traffic, Papa 6 Delta Charlie is on the 2 mile for the 45, runway 35, full stop, Aurora traffic.
And Diamond Delta Charlie, we don't have the downwind traffic.
Okay, we've completed our checklist now, and we're making sure there's no traffic. There's no traffic, and we're going to taxi position, hold, and take off. For traffic, Bonanza 169 Golf Romeo, taking runway 17. Traffic, Bonanza 169 Golf Romeo, departing 17.
Although the regulations place responsibility on the owner or operator for maintaining an aircraft in an airworthy condition, the PIC, or pilot in command, is responsible for determining if the aircraft is in condition for safe flight.
Now, Bob, we all know the owner-operator is responsible for maintaining the aircraft in an airworthy condition, but the pilot in command is responsible for determining if the aircraft is safe to fly. What's the difference between the two? Renter
Pilots don't consider themselves when the regulations talk about owner-operator. But Part 1, the definition of operator, says someone who operates an aircraft, and that's the pilot. So they have to have that responsibility. It's not easy to lay hands on the logbooks, engine and airframe logbooks. Most FBOs keep them locked away. But the pilot in command is the one that has the monkey on his back. Now, airworthiness directives are addressed to the owner of the airplane. The pilot couldn't be expected to know about airworthiness directives, but the mechanics know about them. I really recommend that everybody get together with a mechanic, go over the aircraft and airframe logs, and learn how to read them, how to find things.
Okay, next up, hand propping.
Finally, we'll cover hand propping the airplane. Now, if you're caught with a dead battery, you may have to hand prop the airplane in order to get it started. Hand prop only when absolutely necessary and when precautions have been taken. A rotating propeller has significant energy and can cause an injury or even death. Now, chock should be set in front of the main wheels, and the airplane's tail should be securely tied down. Using the proper technique is essential for a successful outcome. A qualified pilot very familiar with the operation of the aircraft should always be at the controls in the cockpit with the brakes set. The person swinging the propeller should be thoroughly familiar with the propping procedure.
Okay, let's take on our final question in lesson number 2, and this question deals with hand propping. Should it become necessary to hand prop an airplane engine, it is extremely important that a competent pilot. Please consider these 3 answers carefully. Well, have you got the answer? Certainly hope so. Should it become necessary to hand prop an airplane engine, it is extremely important that a competent pilot be at the controls in the cockpit. Again, a reminder, because of the hazards involved in hand starting airplane engines, it is extremely important that a competent pilot be at the controls in the cockpit and that someone familiar with the procedure be turning the propeller, and finally that all communications and procedures be agreed upon and rehearsed beforehand. That's it for our lesson number 2. Let's move on when you're ready for lesson number 3, flight instruments.